Hi, and welcome to Terrorism. This is Chapter 11, Homeland Security. So, we're going to be talking about, again, the concepts of Homeland Security and how that's evolved as a result of responses to terrorism. So, the book first talks about the threat from homegrown jihadists. And it's a significant threat to Homeland Security, particularly in Europe and the United States, more so in Europe because of the proximity and the way their borders are created. All the countries are so close together and all of that. It's a little bit less so because our borders are a little bit more maintained here. We have Canada on top and Mexico, and then huge oceans on the side. Whereas in Europe, it's just a bunch of countries together, and, they have those areas where the jihadists are coming in from the Middle East, so it's a little bit tougher to maintain. But nonetheless, so they talk about in the book the examples of the Madrid train bombing, the London transportation attack, that was 2005, the Madrid train bombing, that was in 2004, and the Fort Hood incident, that was 2009, where the soldier came into Fort Hood and started shooting people. And the Boston bombing incident, those were the two brothers who created the home bombs and placed them towards the finish line, right? One interesting thing about that is that what I saw in the videos is one of the bombs, they were Chechen, ethnic Chechens. And one of the bombs was placed by the Russian flag, which was interesting. They didn't show where the other bomb was placed. So it seemed like there was definitely some message being sent there. And that was, I've never heard that really being discussed. But it'd be interesting to know where that other bomb went. However, nonetheless, people were killed in that incident and many more injured. So, the crisis of Homeland Security, they talk about this in the European context. So, in the European context, how do they deal with Homeland Security? It's a little bit different. In the United States, we responded to terrorism in the post 9/11 context by creating the Department of Homeland Security, by passing the Patriot Act and doing these various things, Homeland Security Act, and all of this to sort of respond to that and create new agencies and bureaucracies and all of that. In Europe, they've been dealing with it for so long, various terrorist type incidents, not just from jihadists, but also from the IRA or different groups, the Basque groups in Spain and different things like that. So they work with it within their different agencies inside their countries, and then they share information across state lines as needed. So they kind of work in this sort of cooperative sort of way. In the United States, it's different, obviously. So we responded, like I said, by creating Homeland Security, by in the Department of Homeland Security. Just one second. So, like I talked about, so we passed the Patriot Act in 2001, Department of Homeland Security Act the next year, the U.S. Patriot Act Improvement and Reauthorization Act was in 2005, and the U.S. Freedom Act, that was we had to reauthorize the Patriot Act 10 years later, and that was sort of like an update and improvement of it. Improvement, depending upon who you are and how you want to look at that. So the first terrorist really legislation that we passed was in 1996, and that was a domestic terrorism legislation that was in response to the Oklahoma federal buildings bombings. That was the first omnibus sort of anti-terrorist legislation that allowed for the death penalty and all of that to be instituted in relation to acts of terror and all of that. So this is a good chart and sort of lays it out on domestic terrorism versus the new terrorism. And that is on page 240. So the Homeland Security agencies, those are a network of specialized agencies that contribute to the overall mission of securing the United States from terrorist threats. There are multiple of them, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Law enforcement and bureaucracy. So in the federal context, we have the law enforcement aspect of it. We have the bureaucratic aspect of it. So, just one second. So, we'll look at that in just a second. So, the law enforcement and bureaucracy. So, the federal context. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, as it's known for short, they have, like I said, there's multiple agencies. There's a chart that sort of spreads it out for you on page 238. It's a vast chart. There's a list on page 244 of the various departments of Homeland Security. There are many, okay? ICE is one example. That's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. TSA, those are the people that pat you down when you go to the Air Force. I mean, not the Air Force, the airport. I'm sorry. And then, of course, the Domestic Nuclear and Detection Office. Okay, there's tons more of them as well. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have. Again, that's on page 244. There are many different agencies that fall under the Department of Homeland Security. And so the Department of Homeland Security was created to sort of deal with some of these sort of agency challenges that were going on in the post 9, the pre 9/11 environment. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the U.S. intelligence community, the mission and challenges. The mission. Intelligence collecting is divided between agencies that are separately responsible for domestic and international intelligence collection. So you have the FBI, which is supposed to be for domestic, for example, and the CIA, those are the two most well-known, is responsible for international, right? And technically they're supposed to, work together when possible, okay? But they are separately responsible for those two separate domains, right? FBI, domestic, CIA, international. Sometimes their interests may overlap, okay? But that's when the problem comes in to play, right? So the U.S. intelligence community mission and challenges. So you have problems of intelligence coordination. So you can have problems sharing intel between nations, okay, even when they are allies. Sometimes you might have countries that, they just don't really want to share that information with you. Maybe it's because they don't particularly like who's in the White House at that time and they feel like they can't trust that person. Or maybe it's, something else. Maybe if they have some information that they are holding back because they're concerned that it might compromise somebody that's, in their parliament, or people that the, queen or whoever it is, right? So they might be holding back some information. So it can be difficult sometimes to get other nations to share their intel. Okay. Like I alluded to a minute ago, sometimes sharing intel between agencies, you have overlapping and competing interests, right? Sometimes the CIA doesn't want to share the information with the FBI. And this is one problem that was happening in the pre 9/11 environment. Uh, Sometimes the CIA had information and it didn't want to give it to the FBI because it wanted to be the one to, get Al Qaeda first, or vice versa. The FBI might have gotten some information on people, in country, and they wanted to be the one to nab them and not the CIA, right? So, you know, it's that sort of competition between agencies sometimes, and this was one problem that they were facing. Sometimes you also get intra-agency intel sharing issues between people who are in field offices versus people who are, at the agency or something like this. Um, and, behind the desks. And they don't want to share their information because they have competing interests, right? People that are missing the big picture, right? And out for themselves rather than, doing the right thing, okay? People are human beings and these things happen, right? And so there are examples of some successes. Your book talks about an example of US and Morocco sharing intel in 2002. So please take a look at that. In interest of time, I'm not going to go over that. It's on page 248. There's problems of collection and analysis. It comes down to the fact that collection of intelligence and the analysis of the intelligence that you collect is not exactly an exact science, and it's not low risk, right? So you are only going to get, it's based on the quality of the data that you get, right? And the amount of data that you get. The more data you have, and if it's high quality data, the better chances, the higher probability of a correct analysis you're going to have. Okay, that's just the math of it, right? But if you have low amounts of intel, right, and you're not very sure about the quality of it, or if you know that the quality is bad, you run into very high risk situation of perhaps that intel is bad, and any decisions that you make based on that intel are going to be problematic. If you get it right, it's going to be just based on luck, not because, of any um, skill on your part. Okay. Um, so your book talks about the example in March 2005, a report was released on the Iraq situation where, the Bush administration had gone into Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction and did not find any. This was based on really poor intel. One of the main pieces of intel ended up being one guy who had an axe to grind against not Osama bin Laden, I'm sorry, against Saddam Hussein. And one of the cardinal rules of intelligence is that you never base, especially a war, on one guy's information. You need to corroborate it with, cross corroborate it with other bits of intel. Okay. And so this is one reason why I think I mentioned before. I remember being when I was at the United Nations during this time when they were asking, when Bush was asking to go to war, um, and asking for the United Nations permission to do so. Their inspector, the United Nations inspector, weapons inspector Hans Blix, had been in Iraq and he had been looking and so far had not found anything. And he said, I need more time. I haven't completed my investigation. So far, my investigation has turned up nothing that would even suggest that there are any weapons of mass destruction currently in Iraq. Not any that are operational, at the very least. And I need more time to complete my investigation before we go in there. If something were to turn up, that would be one thing. And I remember the countries of the United Nations being very, very angry at Bush when he came there asking for permission to go to war. And they turned him down. And then a couple of weeks later, General Colin Powell came as well. And at that time, people had more respect for Colin Powell, right? But they felt he was being duped, that he was being lied to. And so they were a little bit nicer to him. But, still at the end of the day, the answer was no. No. And so Bush went in anyway without the backing of the United Nations. And turned up nothing. Some years later, troops did find stuff, but what they found was buried things that were buried back in the 90s, early 90s, some of it the late 80s, stuff like this, and they were non-functional, right? Some chemical weapons, but not nuclear. So still no evidence of nuclear weaponry, only evidence of defunct, non-functional chemical weapons that he could not have deployed if he wanted to, even if he was still in power at that time. And it looked as though he had no intention of doing so because these were missiles that were rusted up and the chemicals were seeping into the ground, this kind of thing. They were non-deployable in any way, shape, or form. And actually a hazard really to the troops and whoever who had found them. So they had to be cleaned up, etc. This kind of thing. So so this is what the report talked about was the incredible failing of the intelligence community at that time. You can find more information on that on page 249, but they don't go into as much detail as I just went into, but they talk about it very briefly. Civil liberties and securing the homeland, security and liberty, historical perspective. So they talk about suppressing the IRA in the United Kingdom, the Metropolitan Police, affectionately called the Met in the United Kingdom. They were usually known to deal with the IRA threats with professionalism, typically would not engage in repression, okay? However, there were instances where miscarriages of justice occurred. Two examples of this were the Guildford Four. They were wrongly convicted in 1974 of bombing. Two of those were convicted of another bombing as well. They spent 15 years in prison before it was finally realized, before they finally had their convictions overturned in 1989 and released. Another example was the Birmingham Six. The police fabricated evidence against them. Okay, this came out in another trial. Their convictions were overturned and they were released in 1991 after 16 years of being in prison. Okay. Please look at box 11.3 for more about the time of troubles. This is the time where there was significant strife between the Catholic South and the Protestant North in Ireland. Again, this is something that's relevant now when we're talking about Brexit, ironically enough. People are concerned about lifting Brexit because the hard border that would return if Brexit were to follow through. Right now, there is no border between North and South, and what people talk about is the thing that keeps the peace is the lack of border, and that if a border were to come back, that tenuous peace that exists between the North and the South would fall apart. Okay, and that there could it could return to another time of troubles. So I definitely want you to take a look at that and think about that, because if Brexit were to follow through, we could be seeing a return to that in some way, shape, or form in the future. Or even if it doesn't, I still want you to take a look at that, because if this comes up again, or if it were to come up in the future, I want you to be aware of that as being a possibility. So, securing civil liberties and civil liberties and securing the homeland, security and liberty. So, historical perspective, the United States, we had a series of Red Scares here in the United States. The first one was the Communist Party of the USA in 1999. They had they sent out a bunch of letter bombs that had been intercepted. There was a bomb that was actually detonated in Wall Street in November of 1920, killing 38 people and injuring over 100 more. So President Wilson authorized his Attorney General, Palmer, to conduct what became known as the famous Palmer raids. This is where he basically raided labor unions, socialists, communists, their houses, headquarters, whatever, and other leftist labor groups. Okay, various leaders were put on trial, and some were arrested, etc. In these sort of like show trials. Okay, so the Great Depression was the second one. This was a result of the popularity of the communists. They became very popular during this time. Due to the economic troubles that people were going through. Okay, this led to the creation of the House on Un-American Activities Committee. This was about the 1940s. This made it a federal crime to create plots to overthrow the federal government. Okay. McCarthyism was the third one, 1950s. This sort of kept up with that idea of, investigating people, looking into people for these un-American activities. McCarthy, who was a senator from Wisconsin, he sort of ratcheted it up to the next level, though. He started looking into people specifically, more specifically, and then taking people and interrogating them publicly on television. Okay, it ruined people's careers, their lives. Some people were famous people, like movie stars and, people who were on radio or, singers, this kind of thing. But also just regular everyday people. Okay, they had their careers ruined. If they were in media in any way, they were blacklisted. Sometimes it was based on unfounded accusations or loose accusations. If you had even attended a Communist Party meeting, you could end up being blacklisted. If you were seen hanging out with anybody who might have been a communist, you could potentially be blacklisted. If you were thought to have any sympathies, meaning that you thought that labor conditions in the country were unfair, you could potentially be they could roll these things out of proportion and turn it into, well, you're really just a communist, aren't you, right? And turn it into something that it wasn't, and you could end up being blacklisted. It was really these horrible authoritarian type tactics, akin sort of to like the Spanish Inquisition. It was really horrific, really terrifying for a lot of people. And so this sort of really ingrained in people the idea of that socialism and communism is bad in any way, shape, or form. Um, so this is, I guess, one reason why we hear now, anytime anybody says the word socialism, particularly older people, they're like, ugh! It was really ingrained in people's concept that, that word is just a dirty word. So we also had wartime internment, Japanese internment camps. This was 1941 to 1945. Um, so these happened in response to the Pearl Harbor attacks. Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time, he ordered that basically all people of Japanese heritage were to report to these various camps along the West Coast. Over 100,000 people of Japanese descent were ordered to these camps. Even if they were American citizens, it didn't matter. Okay, this played a lot on racist attitudes that existed even before the war, related to people of Asian descent. It didn't help when the war started and then Pearl Harbor happened. These people, most of them lost their homes and any and all possessions that they had. In the 80s, there were some, minor reparations that were given to some of these people, and of course, apologies and all of that. Civil liberties and securing the homeland. Balancing civil liberties and homeland security. So the question that we started to think about after 9/11 in particular was this concept of terrorist profiling. Should we, because initially they were, at airports like TSA would like grab people that look like terrorists, whatever that means, right? But people started to cry foul about this because what was really happening was you were just getting innocent people that were not guilty of anything. You're embarrassing them in public, okay? And you're essentially violating their civil liberties, right? And it didn't, this profiling didn't really lead to any sort of viable information. It didn't get anywhere. It didn't prevent anything. The profiling didn't help, right? So they've sort of curtailed that and sort of focused more in other areas. They talk more about that on page 252. The problem of labeling the enemy. So another thing that we had to think about was how are we going to talk about them, when we capture these people, when we go into war against these terrorists, right? And we capture them. Are we going to call them prisoners of war or are they enemy combatants? Because in the Geneva Convention, if we call them prisoners of war, then they have to be treated a certain way with certain rights, to see, under the Geneva Convention, they have the right to a trial within a certain amount of time and, very specific civil rights and all of this that they're entitled to. However, if they're called an enemy combatant, they could be held, for example, indefinitely without the right to a trial, right? And so under the Bush administration, the decision was made to call them enemy combatants. This is why we have this problem with the base, for example, at Guantanamo, where these people have been sitting there for literally since the first war happened in 2003, 2002, 2003, where we just have people that have been there, this whole time. And the vast majority of those people ended up being completely innocent and did nothing. But now it's like, what do you do? Because now we've basically radicalized these people who did nothing, and we held them there for years, right? And they've been in contact with people who actually, because a few of them were terrorists, right? And we've been denying them their civil liberties. We've taken them away from their families, and this is literally the prescription of how you make a terrorist, of how you radicalize people. If you look at the French prisons, this is how people in France were radicalized, and one reason why they have such problems in France in particular with problems of terrorism, of domestic jihadist terrorists, because of their repressive policies towards Muslims in that country. And so they were constantly arresting Muslims and for the most minor offenses and then throwing them in jail for long periods of time. And this created a scenario that radicalized people who really weren't criminals, but they became radicalized. And so this is the same thing, but actually worse, because these were people that were put in jail for even longer, indefinitely, never to see their families again, right? So what do we do with these people? Okay. Extraordinary renditions. These are like abductions of enemies to face a U.S. court. So basically, like, we want to get X person. They're like either a terrorist or some specific like war criminal or whatever it is, right? And, you know, this started under the Reagan administration in particular. So we want to just abduct them wherever they are in the world, and we're going to, you know, abduct them and bring them back here to the United States to face a U.S. court and U.S. judge, right? And so the questions about that, how should we deal with that sort of thing? You can look at that on page 253. And then there's the torture debate. Your book talks about the case of Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad. That's where we had U.S. soldiers that were apparently torturing prisoners. Okay, much like it's like a prison camp or base, sort of like Guantanamo. Okay, it was a secret prison that nobody knew existed until these pictures came out of U.S. prisoners doing things like raping prisoners, of sicking dogs on prisoners who were naked, like urinating on prisoners, doing all sorts of horrible things and taking pictures of it, right? Electrocuting prisoners and doing all kinds of inhumane, horrible things. And one thing that we do know is that torture does not work when you're trying to get people to give you information. Typically what they will do is they will give you the wrong information. So the questions around that are serious. And one thing that we do know too is that particularly when you're dealing with torture like this, is that when it's known and when the enemy finds out that you are torturing their prisoners, that puts your troops in harm's way, okay? And that makes that just ends up shooting yourself in the foot, right? So U.S. prisoners became more of a target. And so this was one of the things that ISIS and other people used as like recruiting tools and would talk about in some of their videos and show pictures of and stuff to help their recruiting efforts, was Abu Ghraib, right? So basically our soldiers who were doing these things basically just was helping the enemy, okay, to recruit. So, achieving security. Your book will talk about government responses and different types of government responses that are available, like what types of things can the government do. That is on page 255. And so they mention, for example, disrupting and preventing domestic terrorist conspirators from operationalizing their plans, deterring would-be activists from crossing the line between extremist activism and political violence. Obviously, that's something we want them to not do, right? So we talked early on that it's one thing to have an extremist view, it's another thing to cross that line and then act on it, right? Um, it's not illegal to think bad things. It is, however, to then go and act on them. And so that's one thing that the government can do, is trying to deter people from acting. So your book talks a little bit about those government responses. Countering extremism through reform. So one thing that your book talks about is the concept of trying to deal with homegrown extremists, right? And like reforming the racist and ideological and nationalist attitudes and fanaticism that exists in the country. Okay. And just based on interest of time, I'm not going to go into that into too much detail. So if you can look at that on page 256, it's just two or three paragraphs. So that's it for the chapter. If you have any other questions, just please let me know. Okay. Talk to you later.